Project Red is a bigger story than a lot of people are giving it credit for. A lot of the information about why Project Red even came to be surrounds the fact that Japan's population is falling dramatically. It seems pretty obvious, but for the sake of clarification, if you don't have a lot of kids in your country, it's hard to sell a children's property with any sort of major success. The Kamen Rider property didn't really suffer that downturn because it was a much more mature product to begin with, as opposed to Super Sentai, which geared itself to more light-hearted storylines. Kamen Rider, inversely, was more engaged with a darker tale about a protagonist that was plagued by his responsibility, not gifted this magical role of saving the world with your friends and a giant robot or two. Kamen Rider Zets even sets out to tell a more mature story than usual for Kamen Rider, as it seems to be centering on a man who doesn't have direction in his life outside of his dreams, which, I don't know about you, but a lot of young men in the world can really resonate with. I'm not so much sure that teenagers can resonate with this. Even the story of Zet's protagonist is sort of indicative of how a lot of young men in Japan feel. A failure to live up to potential, a desire to create good in the world but finding no real material method to do so, and having to do menial work that doesn't satisfy the need in their soul to build a better place to live. Some of this attitude found its way into Gozuger, where we see the protagonists, the lead heroes, all five, appear to come from a background of being a loser. Some type of extreme personality in Japan that's sort of outside of the norm. Even the wannabe idol is a bit introverted from time to time and finds himself second-guessing the talents that he knows are real and knows work for him. The story of Japan is probably best told in how its corporations that were once targeted at children are now trying to reach a global audience while also maturing themselves up to reach a more adult audience. No, that does not mean you're going to get sexy Gavan or sexy Kamen Rider or anything like that. That's not exactly what they're aiming for, but expect more female characters to be present and to have a more sultry role than they possibly have had in the past. We've seen this with Kamen Rider Gotchard, where we had the very first female secondary rider in the franchise's history. That is not to say that Japan is hostile to these ideas, because we've seen this with the Sailor Moon productions over the years. They have no problem with female protagonists that don't exist inside of a hentai world, but rather exist in a heroic world where they themselves are saving the day. Even if Tuxedo Mask is there to bail them out when they get in over their heads. But the reality is that Japan recorded its lowest number of births since they started recording this number back in 1899. There's a lot of talk about the socioeconomic impact of what happened to Japan when their economy went through a bubble burst scenario back in the 1990s, and then again during the collapse of the 2008 housing crisis, which led to people in my generation, I'm not Japanese, but people in my age group in Japan becoming the forgotten generation, because for 1 year, corporations were not hiring kids out of university, which meant that there's a whole group of people out there that trained their entire young lives to go to work somewhere, and they could not get that job because corporations couldn't afford to hire people as they had been doing for decades leading up to that moment. These kids expected to leave university and land in the work that they would do for the rest of their lives. And now, a great deal of them are stuck in the gig economy or low-paying wage jobs that simply don't satisfy what they were trained to do. You can go on and on about the amount of money it costs to raise children in Japan, but the reality is that when that information finds its way down to people who are ready to have kids, it is a very scary kind of information that's coming through. While it may seem very robust and romantic to raise a child without modern comforts, not necessarily like in a shed somewhere, obviously, but to raise a child without all the techno gizmos that appear to be required to raise a child now, it sounds very romantic. But the reality is, in order for that child to remain competitive in an environment like the average Japanese citizen has to deal with, they're going to need to have all of that exposure to all of that technology, or otherwise, they are going to always be behind their peers who were exposed to that technology. The thing to remember is that the number of seniors that are employed in Japan is continuing to rise, and it sets record after record, year after year on the global scale. I'm not even talking about like Japan's own record keeping, setting record numbers of elderly employed. This is on a global scale. South Korea is leading the charge on this, but nearly 80% of Japanese 65 years old are still working. Again, to the American mind, that sounds, oh, yes, well, people have to work their way to retirement. Some people don't retire until they're 70. But what I need to illustrate to you is that 80% of these people are still in the workforce doing regular hours, not reduced elderly hours. This is regular 9 to 5 Japanese corporate workers that are going in until they're 70 years old or older in numbers enough to compete with the youth in those very same spaces. The United States is far below this, and you would expect that to be inverse, but no, it turns out that South Korea is leading the charge, Japan is just behind them, the United States is far below them, and the European nations are even further than that. But the reality is that this is creating a competitive environment that has compounded how hard it is for young people to get into the Japanese economy, as well as influence that economy with their buying power as a result of their employment. That employment also allows them to purchase a home and thus start a family. That family would then need entertainment for the children born of that family, and thus Super Sentai was there to fill that gap. These demographics define the old age dependency ratio. This is the number of people older than 64 relative to the number of working age people. It's in Japan that this ratio is the highest in the world. As the chart shows, it surpassed 50% in 2021. This means that there are only 2 working age people for every elderly person in Japan. Italy and Finland come next at 37%, closer to 3 working age people for every elderly person. Now, for an example, the global figure is 15%, a ratio of 1 to 6. That's right, 1 elderly person to 6 younger working age people. The world is aging overall, and some countries are aging much more rapidly than others. I don't believe that Project Red is going to be boring by any measure, but I don't believe that we should expect it to behave like Super Sentai. The market for that just simply doesn't exist globally anymore, let alone in Japan. Does that mean there are no children in the world? No. But it does mean that there are dramatically less children in this world than there were when you and I came up, and before us even. We instead need to pay attention to how Toei handles this transition from Super Sentai over to Project Red, because it'll help us understand how that's going to play out with our media going forward. We already see this in a lot of the superhero stories that are coming out, is that they're very dark and very adult-oriented, whereas kids are the initial target audience for any of these things to initially become things in reality. Batman used to sell Hostess fruit pies. Now he's busy getting his face obliterated by Bane.